Welcome to our presentation on Chapter 14 of our textbook. In this chapter, we're going to discuss the safety and security issues that hospitality managers face, especially in the hotel situation. So let's begin. We're going to have 4 topics that we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. The first is kind of an explanation about why we care about security and safety. There's probably not a lot of people out there who have real question marks about it, but it certainly sets up a paradigm for us to use as we explore the topics, the substantive topics that we'll discuss during the majority of the chapter. Then we're going to discuss a 4-step plan that we can use or adapt to pretty much any type of crisis situation that we might be confronting in our particular business. The problems that we'll be confronting are going to vary depending upon the nature of our business and also the geography, where we're located, what part of town, what town we're in, what part of the country we're in. Obviously, in Florida, we don't have to worry about blizzards, and we don't have to worry about hurricanes in North Dakota. So the issues that come up are going to vary, but virtually every part of the country is going to have some kind of natural disaster that can happen, and obviously all parts of the country can face man-made crises. So after we finish talking about how we're going to approach planning for and implementing crisis management programs, we're also going to discuss the topic of crimes against hospitality businesses, and that goes under the security title, obviously. And finally, we'll discuss overall how we're going to manage our crisis management programs. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to distinguish between safety and security programs. A safety program are those that bundle of procedures and activities that we as the hospitality manager have developed to ensure the physical protection of our guests and our employees. It's always important to remember that while sometimes our focus may be on guests, but an equally, sometimes in some respects, more important part of our population are our employees. They deserve and are entitled to every bit as much protection as our guests, and so we need to value their safety very, very highly. So for a safety program, we're really talking about the safety of human beings. And then we're going to talk about security. And this one we're focusing on stuff. Obviously, safety programs come before security programs. We're always more concerned about human lives than we are about the stuff that we happen to own or be responsible for. That order is really, really important. Having said that, it's not as if we're usually going to have to choose between the two. A good security program usually increases the safety of our guests and our employees. And so really the two aspects of the program usually have a supportive role. But in those unusual circumstances where we have to choose between the safety of our guests and employees and property, we're always going to choose safety over security. Okay, well, let's talk about crisis. Crisis is, of course, exactly what you think it is. It's when some situation has developed that has the potential to cause a lot of danger to either people, so obviously this would be a safety issue, or the stuff. It could be the stuff of people or the stuff of our guests or our employees, or the stuff that belongs to our business, and that would be a security issue. Crises can arise in lots of different ways. Certainly natural disasters, man-made disasters, all kinds of possibilities along those lines that can arise. And of course, here are a list of just a few. You might think that a power outage is hardly a crisis, but it creates the opportunity for other crises to develop. If there's a power outage and you're a very tall building, people might be stranded, especially people who are not very mobile. Perhaps they're in a wheelchair, or they have health issues that make it impossible for them to go up and down stairs. Even if a person is able to go up and down stairs, especially if the stairwells are not well lit, there might pose hazards in terms of falling or things like that. I'll relay a personal experience that I had when I worked for a downtown law firm in Houston. I officed on the 36th floor. Unfortunately, one day when I was working there was a fire in the, I guess, electrical hub of the building in the basement. Unfortunately, one person was killed as a result of the fire, another person was badly injured. Um, as a result of that fire, we lost all power to the facility, including all backup power. And so there was also quite a bit of smoke. There were people stranded in elevators for hours. I wasn't, fortunately, it was not in an elevator, but I had to go down the 36 floors. In fact, actually, we exited out of the basement. So I think it was actually 38 floors that I went down. The floors were smoke filled and were completely dark inside. And there were thousands of people going down these stairs. And so every time you got to the bottom of a landing, you weren't sure that it was a landing because it was pitch black inside the staircases. It was a very, very upsetting experience, even though the vast majority of people were not injured. Something as simple as a power outage absolutely can be a crisis and can present all kinds of issues along those lines. We also have other things that are relatively common, things like vandalism or um, uh, uh, a situation where somebody is injured. We can have situations of civil disturbance. Maybe there's rioting. It may have nothing to do with your particular business. It could just be that there's some kind of social or political issue that is affecting people. And sometimes the bad elements in that particular population choose to take advantage of the unrest to loot or to do damage to facilities. Then we have maybe crimes that are more focused on actually harming people, things like arson and bomb threats, robbery, looting, things along those lines. We can have natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, blizzards, things along those lines. We can have medical emergencies such as a drug overdose or a heart attack or a fall that has resulted in significant danger. And that might actually require some type of a medical intervention, perhaps before even the emergency facilities can arise. People die in hotels, unfortunately. Sometimes it's from natural causes. Sometimes it's because of a violent end. Sometimes it's because of suicide. And so all those can present challenges for the hotel. So we can see that there's lots of types of crises, and we can't always even anticipate all the particular twists and turns that might develop in a crisis. So you plan for and anticipate as much as you can, and you hope that the training that you have caused or created for your employees kicks in, and their individuals are able to rise to that situation in the best way to ensure the safety of everyone, guests and employees, and also to keep property safe when possible. So what are the advantages of pre-planning? I know it's kind of an obvious thing. Of course, you're going to pre-plan, but it's helpful to keep in mind what you're going to get out of it, because that might be kind of motivating or inspiring to perhaps do a little bit more of an efficient job. One thing, of course, is the benefit that it has to employees. Everyone wants to be safe at work. Everyone wants to be in an environment in which their safety is a priority of the company. And by having these plans in effect, that's going to make employees feel more safe and more motivated in their employment. They're more likely to stay. It can be an important factor, and especially when a crisis happens and the management are able to preserve everybody's safety because of that pre-planning. That's a really powerful message to those employees that they matter to the organization and that their well-being is important. Also, how management is viewed by the larger community, by potential customers, by the media. All of those things are improved when you have that pre-planning. It may not be known in the community that you're involved in pre-planning, but when that emergency happens, you're the entity that's going to be more successful at maneuvering through those difficult times. Obviously, a an entity that has an effective, well-established crisis management program may find it easier to recruit members into their staff. That may not have a big impact, but you can see how, especially again after that crisis situation, people might look upon that employer and say, that's the kind of place I want to work. It can have actual bottom line implications as well. Insurance rates can drop if you can demonstrate that you have certain plans in effect and certain checks and balances to make sure those plans are going to go into effect. It can also reduce employee costs, less workers' compensation costs, less sick days off. Whenever you increase morale, you're also going to have a more effective and more productive workforce. So those are all positives. So those are some important things to think about as you are planning all the benefits that you're going to get when you have these plans in effect and you use them. Obviously, whenever you don't have plans in effect, there's the potential that you'll be in violation of state or federal rules, and there can be penalties associated with that. Financial penalties, certainly, but they can also be bigger than financial penalties. They can be the cost of investigation, of having that negative exposure from the media, perhaps. All of those things are a cost associated with having a violation. Guests are going to be happier when they see that the hotel is run efficiently. They're going to feel safer. They're going to have a more positive reaction to that particular facility from that perspective. Obviously, you don't want guests to be exposed to that crisis if you can avoid it, but you can't manage all of those things, and you want to make sure that you have as an effective a response as possible. To make guests feel safe, to make them feel that they are respected, and that their concern and well-being is a high priority for the facility. It can also help in terms of marketing. You can use these programs that you have in place as a way to communicate to potential guests that you are the right place for them to stay. And then obviously you're going to reduce the likelihood of negative press. We can't control the press. Sometimes the press may describe activities in your facility inaccurately or incompletely, and your ability to respond to that is somewhat limited. But you can reduce the likelihood of having those outcomes, reduce the severity of the comments if you have a good story to tell, if you have a story that should present your business in a positive light. So all these are reasons why you ought to think seriously about pre-planning for crises, and hopefully they'll be motivating for you to make this a priority, not just a priority at the beginning of your term, but also a priority throughout your time as a hospitality manager, because it's something that requires a constant awareness, and it's easy to be caught up in the day-to-day responsibilities that you have and perhaps put aside as not as important or something that can be done on another day, crisis management. But of course, we don't know when the crisis is coming. It may be much more urgent than we think. So that's the first topic. It's important to manage both safety and security and provide those in an environment. But my guess is we all knew that before we started, so I'm probably not telling you something you don't already know. Let's come up with a paradigm that's going to help us develop those programs that we're going to need to keep our guests and our employees safe and our property safe. And this is, oops, I didn't have the numbering correct here. I apologize. This obviously should be a 3 and a 4 here. So let's look at our 4-step program. And again, this particular paradigm can be used or adapted really for any type of crisis that your business might be facing as you're planning. The first thing you have to do is you have to know what you're concerned about. What is the threat? What is the potential crisis? Only when you've diagnosed the potential problem can you decide how to best respond to that problem. And no facility is going to have just one category of problems. There'll be lots of different potential problems, and there may even be programs that you develop that are designed to respond to several of these problems at the same time. For example, if you are in a part of the country that has to face hurricanes, you're also going to need to have a plan to protect against, say, storm surge and flooding. You might sometimes have flooding without the hurricane, but some of the concerns that you have with flooding would apply to also the hurricane situation. So sometimes a plan that addresses one issue can address more than one issue. So the first thing you're going to want to do with respect to a particular plan is figure out what you're concerned about. And then the next thing you're going to do is come up with a plan to respond to that particular threat. And we'll talk more about this in the next slide, but let's just kind of go over our schema first. So we're concerned about how we're going to address that particular threat. Sometimes we can reduce that threat by engaging in behaviors that reduce the likelihood of us confronting that particular danger. I mean, we can't really do that with a hurricane. We can't do something that's going to persuade the hurricane to go to a different city. So we have limited ability in some cases to reduce the likelihood of the threat. But we can reduce the impact that that particular threat will have on us even when we can't reduce the likelihood of that threat. And even in times when we can't reduce the impact that it's going to have on us, how we respond to that impact can be very, very significant. So we're going to develop the plan, but when the crisis comes, having a plan is a lovely thing, but it only works when that plan is actually implemented. So we have to make sure that when we're in that crunch situation, when we're in that crisis, that everybody is doing what they need to do, and that the plan is detailed enough that everybody knows their role, but flexible enough to respond to that unexpected, that surprising development along the way. Then after the crisis, when it's completed, when it's over, when people have been able to catch their breath, then we're going to do kind of a post-mortem. We're going to want to evaluate our program and also our implementation of that program to see where we were successful and where we can be more successful. But we'll also want to look and see where are opportunities. Where were we not as successful as we would have liked to have been? And can we make changes into the program so that we reduce the likelihood of having a repeat of that lack of success? Or are there ways of implementing the program differently that will increase our likelihood of success? So we always want to go through this fourth stage after the fact. And it's not really designed to beat us up for failings that we had. It's inevitable that when we think about something in abstract, we assume that it's all going to work out great, and then we realize, wait a second, we didn't consider the fact that we might not have power or something like that. Or we didn't consider the fact that our intercom system doesn't run on batteries. It runs on power. And so maybe we need to have a backup system. It's inevitable that you're going to forget those things, but you want to learn from it so the next time the program is a little bit stronger and a little bit more resistant to those unexpected developments. So now we're going to focus on this point here, the program development stage. Here we go. So here are some behaviors that we are likely to want to incorporate into a program development into our programs. Probably there's going to be some training aspect that's involved in our program development, training of our employees, what we need to train them to do, how we're going to train them, when we're going to train them, how often we're going to train them, what medium or media are we going to use to train them. All those we need to figure out. But the idea that we're going to need to train as part of our program development is probably in 90 or 95% of the times going to be necessary. Many of our programs are going to involve some level of surveillance or patrol. Some way that we're going to monitor the situation. Well, let's imagine that we're in a part of the country that we face the possibility of hurricanes. Well, we're going to want to monitor the weather. I mean, this might just be as simple as watching the local news or turning to weather.com to see what the prediction is in terms of the risks from the hurricane. So sometimes it may be a very low-tech solution, But there may be times where we have a much more high-tech approach. For example, going back to my story of when I was in the high-rise office building, what if they had had some kind of backup camera system in those stairwells, or had some way of communicating to people in those stairwells? That might have increased the safety and the comfort level of the people inside those stairwells during that time. So we want to consider different technologies and consider how we want to approach it. There's lots of different ways of approaching it, but two kind of buckets we might want to think about for this would be using human beings. I use the term employee here, but in many cases it may be an independent contractor or a service provider, for example, a guard service. But in other words, have a human being be the surveiller or the patroller. Other times they may want to use technology. Cameras, for example, is a pretty common technology for this types of situation. There's pros and cons to both approaches, and it kind of depends upon the totality of the circumstances how you want to approach it. Let's say that you have a restroom area in your large hotel that has seemed to attract an unsavory population, and they're engaging in behaviors in your hotel bathrooms that are not appropriate, and you want to address that. Well, you're not going to want to have cameras inside the bathroom. That's a pretty obvious thing. You may have cameras outside the doors of the bathroom, out in the public place, so you can record who comes in and who goes out. But if you're going to want to survey that area, you're going to need to have human beings in that space. And so that would be an example of where you'd want to use employees more than technology. There can be other reasons that you may want to use employees over technology. For example, let's say there's a part of your hotel that is, maybe it's outside, and maybe guests have to walk maybe from the reception area of your hotel to their particular hotel, and there have been some instances where there's been muggings or things along those lines, and so you want to monitor the situation more closely, but you don't feel like it's economically possible to have a guard stationed there, so you might put a camera there. But if you aren't monitoring what's on the camera, especially not monitoring it 24/7, it might cause guests to have a false sense of security. They may think to themselves, well, I don't have to worry excessively because if I get mugged, somebody is looking at that camera right now and they will immediately call 911. So I don't have to be as careful when I maneuver around in this area. Well, it may be that the cameras are just cameras, that no one is monitoring it. It could even be that it's not being recorded at this time. And so by using a technology in a way that isn't as complete as maybe assumed by the users, you can actually increase your liability. So there can be privacy aspects with technology. There can be effectiveness aspects with technology, but we can also have those concerns with employees. You know, if you hire a guard to wander around your facility, I shouldn't say wander, but patrol your facility, I mean, there's no guarantee that he won't take a smoke break and hang out just in the smoking area, or she won't hang out with a friend in the reception area and not do a good job monitoring the place. It's even possible that that employee could be in cahoots with some criminal element and might actually be facilitating criminal behavior. So it's a complex subject. You definitely want to consider lots of different tools, and you very possibly will end up using a combination of a human being monitoring and technology monitoring. You want to have some kind of way to inspect your program to see how it is working. The textbook has a long checklist. I think it's about 3 pages long of things that you may want to have in your particular facility, where you have somebody go through on a periodic basis. Maybe it's some of the items probably are going to be daily, some of the problems are going to be weekly, some monthly, some annual. For example, the inspection of your elevator, that needs to be done annually, for example. There may be other things that need to be checked much more regularly, but there certainly will be things we need to check much more regularly. So it's a good idea to use some kind of checklist. You certainly can purchase one that's going to be generic, but you're probably going to want to take a generic one and gear it towards your particular hotel's needs, because obviously the circumstances of your hotel are going to be slightly different than other businesses. The architecture of it, the clientele that you have, the geography where your particular facility is located is going to be different. And so what you need to check and how often you need to check it is going to need to be designed to meet the particular needs of your facility. It's very likely that you're going to periodically need to modify your facility. It may be something as simple as adding extra lighting or making repairs. It may be painting, say, fluorescent paint, or putting non-skid traction taped things on the ground at certain places. All those can be examples of very inexpensive modifications that can significantly increase the safety and sometimes the security of your facility. And so looking for those opportunities, considering ways that you can make your facility safer is an important part of that process. And again, it's not a static part, especially with respect to repairs. The carpet's great today, and maybe it'll be great a month or 2 or 3 from now, but eventually that carpet, some of the tacks that hold it down are going to give. It's going to get frayed. It can present a tripping hazard, and so you have to constantly be looking for those signs of wear and tear. It's a good idea to see what your competitors are doing, maybe walking through their hotels and seeing what they use to keep their guests and employees safe and their property safe. Can give you ideas about, I hadn't thought about doing this, or that's a smart idea to have that particular feature. So constantly be considering, how can I make my facility more safe and more secure? And then you'll want to have, the standard procedures. Again, that fits under the idea of checklist to some extent, that you have these well-established procedures so everyone can be, to some extent, an automatic pilot. They know when they are presented with a situation, they can just refer to the checklist. Oh, I need to do A, B, C, and D. And they don't have to use a lot of independent judgment. And so there ought to be a lot of consistency. And when the guest is unhappy with that answer, the employee can say, I'm sorry, but I'm required to follow these procedures. I don't have any flexibility about that. And so that kind of empowers that employee to, in a considerate way, communicate that this is something that he or she is going to have to follow. Here are some examples of topics that are pretty common to have in a security program within and not just a security, but also a safety program within a hotel. You're going to want to have some way of controlling access to guest rooms. You're going to want to make sure that your security staff is properly selected and trained. You're going to want to have ways that the guest can monitor what's outside the room, and also make sure that they are safe inside their room. Certainly, adequate lighting and maintenance are important factors. We don't want there to be bushes that people can hide behind, or uneven sidewalks that people can trip on. And you'll want to have some level of perimeter control, making sure that people are not using the edges of your property in a way that's not appropriate or safe for your guests and your property. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these first 2 topics, how to handle key issues. And of course, this is going to vary depending upon your particular business, but these are some things to consider as you develop these programs. It's a good idea, certainly in this day and age, to have an electronic locking system for guest rooms. The old room key system was kind of fraught with some hazards. I, the guest, can get my room key copied and then return to that room after I am no longer a guest of the hotel and gain access to that hotel room. Or I can keep my key, even after I am no longer a guest, saying, oh, I lost the key or something along those lines. That's a risk if we actually use room keys. Another problem with room keys is that there's no record of anyone entering the room because it's not an electronic system. But when you're using keys, you don't know if somebody went into the room at 2 p.m. that day or not, and you don't know whose key was used if someone was entered. So we don't have the record that we would have if we were using an electronic system. If you decide to develop an electronic system, though, you have to make sure that your employees are well trained about how to use it. You want to make sure that the program, again, you'd have the lots of different people obviously have the need to go into rooms, the housekeeping staff, the maintenance staff, possibly the room service staff. You could have the bus boys, the bellhops, those types of people also being involved in accessing keys. And we want to make sure that they are familiar with the rules that are in place about how to do that type of process. When guests are checking in, you always want to make sure that their room numbers are not communicated out loud. And they should be written down on a sheet of paper and should be shown to the guests, ma'am, this is your room number. And again, the person registering them would point to that room number so that the guest would be familiar with that information. That's to protect against the person who might be in line behind that guest who might be interested in some improper motive or improper behavior with respect to that guest. You also should not put the room number directly on the key. When it's on the key, if a guest mislays the key, then maybe at the bar or at the swimming pool or in the elevator or someplace like that, someone could take that key and then gain entrance to the room. If all they have is the plastic electronic card but not the room number, the potential thief would have to go to every single room, and presumably before that would happen, they would be stopped. And so the possibilities of doing mischief would be significantly reduced. Motels and hotels like to advertise naturally. You want to increase your customer base, but a good place to advertise is not on the key because, again, that creates the potential for somebody to use that key and gain access to a room to which they are not entitled. So you want to have those room keys to be as bland and as uninformative as possible. No room numbers, no hotel information. Sometimes guests are going to lose the key. They mislay it or they leave it in the room, and they're going to come to the front desk and say, hey, I need help getting into my room. And they're probably not going to be too happy. Maybe they're still wet from the pool, for example. So you have to have a process, in effect, that is respectful of the guest, that is considerate of their particular situation, but is also making sure that the room key is not issued to people who are not properly given that room key. And so there needs to be some kind of ID check. What may need to happen is you may need to accompany the guest back to his or her room, because if the person has locked himself out of his room, his or her wallet or purse will likely be in the room, and so they would need to actually go to the room and have the guest show identification to show that, yes, this is in fact my room. You ought to issue duplicate keys only to registered users. You may think, well, this person has the same home address on his driver's license as our guest, and they happen to have the same surname, so surely this is the spouse. Of course I can issue a duplicate key under those circumstances. But what you don't know, potentially, is that maybe this is a domestic abuse situation. Maybe the husband and wife has left the home and moved to the hotel because of concerns about personal safety with respect to his or her spouse. And so we don't want to issue keys willy-nilly under those circumstances. We shouldn't assume that we know what's going on in the relationship. That victim of domestic abuse is not likely to volunteer that information to the person who is registering them in the hotel. There's no reason why they ought to. So we need to still require that information before we issue another key. We don't want to have a lot of master keys running around. As you can see, as soon as you have a lot of those keys, there's the potential for them to be lost or stolen or misused. Only a very few number of people need to have that kind of access, and we ought to keep that number as small as possible. We never know exactly what's going on in someone else's minds, and while we do need to have some master keys, we want to control that number so that our guests are as safe as possible. We obviously need to have a log of all those masters, and some masters, again, some master would be a key that functions only on certain rooms or certain doors, so that we know who has them. And so if that person ceases to be an employee, for example, that we cancel their access to that master, or we cancel that key. And we also keep a track of where those masters and submasters go. If suddenly we see that a master is being used more frequently than it ought to be, or in places that it ought not be, then that raises good questions that we ought to ask. And that follows up on this idea of a lock audit. We ought to be seeing how our keys are being used. And that's a good process for a manager on duty to have, to make sure that, in fact, masters and just generally room keys are being issued appropriately and being issued following the procedures that we have. And when there's irregularities or inconsistencies, that we track those down. So we'll want to record the results of those audits. Again, a lot of the things that we do in managing these risks is keeping a record. We keep the record for lots of reasons. One reason that we do is we want to be able to demonstrate, if there is some kind of bad outcome, that we had systems in place that we were following to reduce the likelihood of those bad outcomes. The record, though, also helps us to learn from our mistakes and our less than perfect processes, so we can evaluate and say, wait a second, this happened. Did it happen before? Oh yeah, it sure did. So there's a trend now. It helps us gather the data that we need to make the best and most informed decisions. So let's consider some of the elements. We talked about behaviors before. Now we're going to talk about the elements of the program. And some of these are the same, a lot of overlap. One can be conducting employee background checks. The nature of the hospitality business, especially when we're talking about hotels, involves really our guests trusting us to a pretty phenomenal degree. They're going to sleep and shower and bathe and have their young children in these places with us, and they are trusting us that our facilities are safe, both from the criminal elements, from dangers like fire and things along those lines. And so it's important that we have a workforce that is consistent with that trust that we are receiving from our guests. And one way of approaching that is by using background checks. This is an area that is very, very complex. When I was working for a large employer as in-house counsel, I was very involved in the background check process that we had there. And a couple things I will share with you. One is that what is lawful to do in terms of background checks really varies from state to state. Currently, Texas does not have many limitations at all on how to conduct background checks. There are federal limitations to some extent. The Fair Credit Reporting Act occurs to me immediately as one of the limitations. And so it does need to be any kind of background check that you implement, and does need to be vetted by an attorney. It needs to be followed consistently. If you have an inconsistent policy wherein you hire one person who has the same criminal background as another person, you expose yourself to the possibility of discrimination type claims. And so you want to make sure that you're very, very consistent in this area. Your major concern is going to be safety concerns. So people who've had a violent criminal background, those individuals you'll want to avoid. People who have had a security kind of risk, people who've written bad checks or been involved in theft situations, or another category of individuals you want to avoid. So you'll want to consider, as you are developing your background check program, exactly what behaviors are permitted and what behaviors are not permitted. Many of the individuals who work in a hotel situation may not have a perfect background. The employment and the wage opportunities that you're able to offer some of your employees may be such that, especially in a strong economy, you aren't attracting individuals who have a spotless, blemishless background. And so there's a careful balancing between is this person a threat to the safety and security of our property compared to how can I staff for these particular functions at the pay rate that I'm able to offer. And obviously another big factor is training, employee training. There's going to be some onboarding training, but there will need to be continuing training. And the importance of training is not simply education, but developing mental habits. Oh, okay, this is what I do next, almost getting to be on automatic pilot. This is especially important in a crisis situation. The adrenaline is pumping, people aren't sure what to do or what's going to happen next. They're afraid. And so if they have been well trained in how to handle the situation, they can kind of trust their memories, their understanding to kick in, and they're like, okay, this is what I do next. I don't have to worry because I know what I'm supposed to do. On the other hand, if they attended a seminar 3 years ago where this was discussed for 30 minutes, they may know that there is a program, but they may not remember the details. They may not remember where to find the details. And so therefore that training may be lost. So you need it to be stuff that the employees know, but they know it at a pretty deep level. They know it at the level that they can retrieve that information quickly and that they can apply it confidently. Obviously, guests, unless you're in a cruise ship, guests are not going to be willing to spend a lot of time being trained in safety and environment. But there are still ways that we can educate our guests. At the time in which they register, there's the opportunity to communicate a very short message about guest safety. Also, at a brochure that we could give them, for example. Also, there can be literature in the hotel room. In fact, most hotels' doors are going to have a guidance as to how you ought to exit the facility if there is a fire or some other emergency like that. You want to make sure that type of information is available, that it is easy to understand, very clear, and ideally set up in such a way that the guest doesn't have to be an English speaker to understand what they need to do under those particular circumstances. You'll want to have written security and safety policies and procedures. You want to have them in writing for lots of reasons, but one is so that the employees can refer to it in that crisis. Because again, there's going to be that moment of panic. And yet if they can say, but let me just go to the manual, I know it's in there, and they can get that manual out, and then that can be almost like a safety blanket or a life raft for them. They know that they can turn to those pages and make the right decisions. And then you'll want to, under certain circumstances, interact with local authorities, most likely law enforcement type authorities, the firefighters, the police officers, the EMTs, individuals like that, to respond to a particular circumstance, a particular crisis. Obviously, it's going to vary depending upon what the crisis is. Okay, so let's look at some program implementation avenues. If you happen to be part of a larger hotel, you're likely to have some kind of a security department, and you can look to the supervisor in that department for guidance. He or she will likely have a significant role in kind of telling you what the best practices are in this particular industry for this particular crisis. But if you're a smaller unit, you may want to actually outsource this particular function so that there is some outside company who will come in, and they probably do this for several different hotels or office parks or whatever, and they will be able to develop those programs and those policies for your facility as well. You may want to consider the possibility of having safety committees. This is, again, kind of a controversial issue. I'm not going to go through all the legal issues with it, but there are some risks associated from a legal standpoint with having safety committees. So before you roll out a safety committee program, I encourage you to talk with somebody in your legal department to make sure that the legal concern that we have is a case called electromation. It has the potential, especially if you're in a part of the country that has some degree of unionization, in this particular, maybe the housekeeping department, for example, in hotels in your area are organized via a union, it can present certain challenges having safety committees. If you're in an area that's relatively has a low rate of unionization in the hospitality industry, it's probably less concerning, but still it's good. It's worth a discussion with the labor and employment attorney to discuss the electromation cases to decide whether a safety committee is right for your particular hotel. But let's assume that you've decided that yes, that's a good choice for you in terms of how you want to run your business. Let's talk about how it would function and why it can be a good idea. First of all, let's discuss kind of what a safety committee is. A safety committee is a group typically of hourly paid individuals, although there's usually some supervisors involved or at least liaisoned with the group. And these are people from various disciplines. So you'd have someone from housekeeping, you'd have someone from the front desk, you'd probably have someone from the restaurant or bar, you'd have maybe someone from the security department if there is such a department. All the different functions within the hotel. You'd want to have one or more representatives of that. And then the group would brainstorm and discuss issues that come up in their particular areas. And they would essentially not just be a spokesperson for themselves, but also for their colleagues. So let's say that I'm in the housekeeping department. I might gather comments or concerns from my coworkers that they've had this concern or that concern come up. And so it might not be my concern that I'm advancing in the safety meeting, but it may be the concern of my colleagues. Sometimes the safety committee might address concerns that have been received by management from other individuals. And so then they might be looking at how can we best solve this problem. And again, it might be a concern that the housekeeping department has, but it might end up that the front desk is the best place to actually work on solving that problem. Or maybe it's a security department that needs to be the lead person for solving that particular issue. And the takeaway is that people outside of their department may not know a lot of people or may not have a lot of connections. And so by coming together to discuss these issues in a safety committee, you might come up with better solutions than if it were kept within a particular department. Another important thing about to consider as you develop safety and security programs is to consider the relationship that you have with local law enforcement. It's important to have a good relationship because there will be times where you will want their support and possibly times where they will want your support. And so you'll want to have established a good relationship there. It may be that there is a neighborhood business watch program in your area. You may want to establish one. Very often when a particular business sees crime in his or her facility, this is a criminal who is working a particular neighborhood. And so having this communication between businesses can really help reduce the likelihood of criminal behavior and can also result in the apprehension of whomever is involved in that criminal behavior. You may ask law enforcement to be kind of the expert that can help you plan for safety issues. Obviously, they have an expertise and a knowledge that very possibly is not housed within your particular facility. And so they may be able to tell you best practices or current issues that they're seeing in the business community and how other businesses have been able to successfully address those concerns. It's also possible that a particular police department may have an interdiction program. We'll talk about that on the next slide. Finally, a law enforcement may offer training programs. It might be how to do CPR, for example. This would not probably be the police officers, but it might be the EMTs from the fire department who could come down and give some help with that, or how to use an AED device. It may also be information about how to appropriately card a guest in a restaurant or bar situation, um, or how to identify a bad or a stolen currency, for example, or counterfeit currency. Those types of things. Law enforcement may have seminars on that, and they function in a couple of different ways. Number one, they can provide very useful information, but they can also help build that relationship between your law enforcement and your staff. And we want that relationship to exist because when that crisis comes, we're going to be relying upon law enforcement to be our partner. So let's talk about interdiction programs for just a second. What is interdiction? Well, it's an arrangement in which citizens contact the police to report stuff that is happening, but that hasn't quite risen to the level of an actual crime. We see somebody acting strangely in the parking lot. They don't seem to be going to their car. They seem to be kind of wandering around, but they haven't done anything yet that seems to be criminal. But it's hard to come up with an explanation for their behavior that isn't suspicious. Well, that would be an example of behavior you might want to contact the police to let them know. The police could then come out and address that behavior with that individual and hopefully persuade that individual to either explain what he or she is doing, if it's innocent, or perhaps leaving the facility and moving on to off of your property at that time. And again, it could be that that person, they could be doing something innocent, or it could be that they are some kind of engaged in some kind of criminal behavior or considering criminal behavior. Well, it's possible that person already has an outstanding warrant or something along those lines. And so when the police become present in the situation, they can address it in a more forceful way than you'd be able to, given the fact that no crime has been committed on your property. We spoke before how it's important to monitor these programs. It's not enough just to have a program in effect and kind of assume that we're good to go. The success and sometimes the failures of programs need to constantly be evaluated. A program that makes a lot of sense today may not make a lot of sense in 10 years when there's different technologies available, when people are conducting themselves in different ways. Okay, so let's look at some ways that we might want to monitor the effectiveness of the programs that we have. For example, we might want to see, are we actually implementing them correctly? Are we doing the inspections that we're supposed to be doing? When we do the inspections, how well are we scoring ourselves? Are we successful? Are all the things that need to be happening? When incidents happen, when we file incident reports, how many of them are? And what are the categories? Do we see a rise in the number of this particular behavior or that particular behavior? How much money are we losing because of theft or property damage or things like that? Is that number rising or falling? Again, also with insurance claims, lawsuits, accidents, the number of work days that employees lose or miss out on. And of course, all of these things can lead directly to insurance program premium increases. Now, obviously, many times insurance premium increases are not tied necessarily to the success or failure of our programs, but could be tied to larger market forces. We'd also want to document the drills that we do, the training that we do, to make sure we're doing it when we need to, and that we're doing it as thoroughly and as appropriately as we need to. Obviously, there's no point in monitoring the effectiveness of a program if we're not open to revising it to address the deficiencies that we see in those programs. So now we're through our first two items in our checklist. We've discussed the importance of having a safe and secure environment, and we've talked about how we ought to develop and implement our safety programs. I'm going to end this particular presentation at this time, and I thank you for your attention. As always, remember that you're welcome to send me, oops, I went too far. Send me an email with any questions that you have, or even better, stop by my office hours to discuss the material. Thank you again for your attention, and I hope you have a great day.